The Faraway Paladin, Volume 3, The Lord of the Rust Mountains Secundus. Wow, this title is a mouthful. Much like this volume is a mouthful of goodness and delicious stuff. I don't know where this metaphor is going, but the point is, this volume is very good. This is perhaps my favorite volume in the Faraway Paladin series, and it almost feels like a series finale, which I will get to in a bit. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start as usual with the cover, and this is the first cover in the series that William is not in, and apparently he's not really needed because this cover bangs. This time no awkward title overlaying the cover, no weird color schemes, just two gods and one dragon, Graceful and Stagnate opposite each other as they should be, and then Valacirca, if you want to go by the Romaji, whatever you pronounce his name as, is just spitting fire central in the cover, just an intimidating presence to start off the epic feel that this volume has. Besides the great cover, we have the intro art, which to me is the best in the entire series. Yes, a bit redundant with the cover, but a dragon spitting fire is always cool. And this one is very good and is flanked by a bit of a spoilery reveal that Stagnate is in fact a lady. And I will be honest, I did not check this image for some reason before reading the book this time, so I was caught by surprise, but even if it's a bit spoilery, it's still a good image. This book is the epic climax of the Lord of the Rust Mountains story, but also the author decided to add in some few pages long side stories, so let's address those first. The first side story is regarding the forest giants and the Lord of the Woods from the previous book. It definitely makes more sense, seeing as this volume is a two-parter, as sometimes when rereading books you see that some plot lines were just kind of forgotten or didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, and I don't want to say that these plot points are super important, but it's nice for them to have some closure, so I like the addition of this side story. Then there's this side story of William giving away what is left of Pale Moon to some young adventurers. This one to me is not as interesting as the previous one, but it's still a plus in my view. Seeing Pale Moon, a weapon that the reader, much like William, have grown attached to ever since Volume 1, be serviceable to the next generation is always a nice addition. This side story does contribute to this sense of finality when reading this book. I don't know if the author planned for this book to be the last one, but he sure wrote it in a way that kind of seems like it, but we'll get to that. And then we have these so-called bonus short stories after the afterword. Their placement initially confused me, but I quickly realized that it's because they're not really connected with the rest of the story, and to be honest, I didn't find much entertainment in these. I'm always a fan of extra content, but these short stories feel quite reiterative on what has already been shown on the main story, with the only ones that you get something new out of being the Manel one and the Antonio one. My favorite was the Antonio short story, but even then, I don't think the reader misses much if they just skip these. Personally, I still read them, and I would still read them, as it's not a mega time investment, they're quite short, and if you already bought the book, then might as well, but they don't add much to the overall scheme of things. They exist, and I guess it's something the author wanted to get out to print, and yeah, they're here. Now, let's actually get into the meat of the matter, the main story of the Lord of the Rust Mountains. The first chapter reads like a tribute to RPG video games. Our protagonists are led into a stash of powerful equipment and they just have fun with it. It's in these moments that you really understand that the author is a fan of video games just like you. Afterwards, on the path to the Rust Mountains, we fight some water snakes, we defeat a hydra, and we even come across this almost extinct tribe of elves. The relationship between Manel and Dean is very cute, and also it builds on top of the theme of loneliness from the previous book. Seeing as Manel will outlive William by a lot, maybe if he gets another elf companion, then it will sort of handle that problem by itself, so I'm looking forward to see how their relationship develops. Also, I love the way that the author depicts elves in this world. They are very proud, but in a way that is noble and not arrogant. They make decisions that may seem puzzling for humans, but make complete sense based on their values. Once again, the world building in this series is one of Faraway Paladin's strongest suits. So the initial part of the book did its job, because by the time you get to book 2, the reader's feeling is, I just want to get to the dragon, show me the dragon already. And the fact that the author managed to make the path to the dragon entertaining while still weaving in some new characters and world building is without a doubt a tremendous feat. We then move into the actual Rust Mountains, and this is where the story starts picking up. First, Al guides his fellow dwarven comrades into the afterlife in a moment that is very fitting for the squire of a paladin of Gracefield. And speaking of squire, at this point in the book, William just says, "Oh, you're royalty, you shouldn't be my squire and I shouldn't be your knight," and Al is still very respectful towards William, as he should be, but I guess this plot point, which I criticized in the previous video, that I thought didn't make much sense, is kind of just swept under the rug, and it still feels so awkward, because their relationship never felt quite of knight and squire, not only because of the age gap, but also because they have completely different fighting styles, so even the mentor relationship is not quite there. Anyway, the fight with the demons in the corridor was very entertaining, with the guys just tearing through hordes of demons, and we finally got a cool scene for Reystov that isn't off-screened. He was unstoppable death incarnate. The moment he encountered an enemy, he leaped into range and killed it with a swift thrust straight out of his normal stance. Finally, a cool scene for Reystov that isn't off-screened. I do think his character is still more sizzle than steak at this point, if you get my metaphor here. But anyway, I wanted a cool scene and I got one. So Reystov, congratulations, you finally penetrated something. And then we got the epic duel of Al versus the Demon General. The shonen-esque duel between the inexperienced but highly motivated protagonist versus the evil and untrustworthy Demon General is always a nice trope, and I'm here for it. It also included the use of Blood's dagger, which was teased in the first chapter, so that was obviously a nice callback. And I do think that Al, narratively speaking, needed this moment, because he's technically the heir to the Rust Mountains, so it would be a bit awkward from a narrative perspective if he was just a passenger and was carried into his birthright and didn't do anything of note. So I think he needed this fight both from an emotional standpoint and even a narrative standpoint. And then comes the big bad boss of the story. The dragon finally appears, and he is introduced by squishing the Demon General that Al struggles so much with, showing his power. And I know that this is a very shonen cliche of big villain defeats small villain to show his power level, but it's the rule of cool, it just works, I don't mind it, it's just a good introduction. And picking up on the theme of courage from the previous video, Mr. Calamity's Sickle starts the interaction with our protagonists with a bargain, which was completely unexpected. He's not outwardly evil or unreasonable, he's like, hey, you guys defeated my demons, so why not team up? William knows that fighting a dragon is a bad idea and that he is very likely to lose, so the fact that the dragon gives him a way out is a very deep test of his courage. Mr. Sickle is very much a Tolkien-esque dragon. He's cunning, he's evil, but he's very intelligent and very well spoken. He makes some compelling arguments. And I love these types of villains. From the previous book, I was expecting the dragon to be very evil and selfish and a force of nature to be reckoned with, which he still is, but he's also someone that can be reasoned with, and that makes him much more persuasive. He knows that he's stronger, but he still tries to negotiate because he sees more upside in that, and we see a repeat of this after he gains the upper hand and he manages to put our protagonist in the most desperate situation possible, this time knowing that he has more leverage, telling them to submit. And I like that he isn't only bad, he relishes in his badness. Multiple times throughout the fight, he says that regardless of the outcome, he will be happy, because he will either add these courageous protagonists into his book of terror, or he will be remembered forevermore in the stories about his slaying. Much like the elves we saw previously, he may have a peculiar rationale from a human perspective, but it sticks strictly to his values. When William asks if he's going to do some pretty evil stuff, he just says, "Yup, that's exactly what I'm going to do." When he smiles at the moment of his defeat, he's genuinely happy, not only because his name will be echoed, but also because he knows that William will now have the dragon's curse, so who really won here? The god Sickle is an incredible villain, and I like how he's almost a counterpart to Stagnate. Stagnate can also be very compelling and persuasive, but Stagnate is more of a manipulator. He's not a god of war, he's not that strong by himself. While Mr. Calamity Sickle is very strong and he is more confrontational and more direct. He can negotiate, but he's also strong and he will enforce his will through his strength if he needs to. Overall, I love the dragon, what an amazing villain, even though I can't really pronounce his name. Now, regarding the fight itself, the first is the actual game plan. Much like William explains, going into a battle of attrition is not in their interests, because the dragon is a godlike figure and will likely outlast them all in terms of stamina, so they have to go for an explosive intro and try to beat him as fast as possible. From a strategic perspective, this makes total sense, but from a narrative perspective, it can be a bit of a bummer. Much like, for example, MMA fights in real life, where we have a quick knockout after months of anticipation and build up to the fight, it can feel quite deflating. So, in fiction, even though the correct strategy would be to finish the fight as fast as possible, it would feel a bit disappointing if the fight was just over like that. So I love the fake out where they think they won. We have the emotional and story payoff of William unleashing his triple casting that he learned from Gus, and then the dragon survives by using what gamers know is the most bullcrap ability possible, which is untargetability, which is very frustrating, and not only for the reader but also in this case for our protagonists. This turns the tables on the fight, and at this point William is effectively fighting the dragon by himself, which is an obvious losing battle. And at this point I'm reading the book and I'm thinking, okay, how will William win this? Because I know there's another book after this one, so William is going to win. How will he do it? And will it be some Deus Ex Machina that makes the story feel unsatisfying? And I loved how the author solved this problem, as it didn't feel out of nowhere. It was heavily hinted at and foreshadowed even by the cover itself. William needed the help of the gods, and so the gods helped him, both his god, Gracefield, and his rival, Stagnate. When the opposing gods of the afterlife joined their forces and raised an army of the undead to fight against the dragon, it felt straight out of Lord of the Rings. It was a very epic moment, and it raised even more the stakes of the fight. The final strike was also very fitting as a throwback to the fight against the Wyvern, where William did the exact same thing, jumping into danger to protect his friends, and it explains why the dragon was afraid of Overeater and was very careful around it. The sword is very strong, and ultimately it resulted in his defeat. The ending was not only awesome, it also read like something out of ReZero. If the narrator said Subaru at some point, I would have believed him, because it was very gruesome, very descriptive, very painful, and also very heroic, so it was nice. William's body being melted away and refusing to give up by constantly healing himself on the dragon with Overeater was a very gory and epic ending to this fight. And now William has absorbed the dragon's power. Much like we saw in the previous books, William was already extremely overpowered for this world, and now he's even 2 steps above that. He didn't quantify it, but he said that he could probably take on a dragon by himself now, so he's pretty much closer to God than he is to human. Fortunately for him, it didn't raise his lifespan, and he quickly didn't let the power get to his head. He reframed it as a curse, because it may make him too strong that he's complacent, and also may distance him from the people that he's trying to help. So a very knightly and virtuous perspective that could only really come from our main character, William. Even if he's the strongest human in the world, he will still keep trying his best and to improve himself, which is very motivational, but from a story perspective, where does that lead us? I said in my review of Volume 1 that the author was very ambitious by starting his story with a fight against a god. Usually we have both our protagonist and his enemies slowly increase their power level so that the story has some sort of progression. If our protagonist hits his skill ceiling, then how do we progress from here with him as a protagonist? Obviously there are exceptions to this, like One Punch Man for example, but those are very different genres. William is now effectively unbeatable. Even some of the characters joke that there likely won't be any stronger enemies from now on, and really the only plot points that are left to be resolved are the elf that has a debt to Gus, which he will come to collect, but that's more of a slice of life, I guess, plot point. And then we have the fight against the High King, but that fight isn't as hype anymore. Because number one, William has now effectively surpassed his mentors, the three heroes, he is very strong on par with the dragon, and William has the sword that made the High King so strong, so that fight isn't even as hype anymore. The series could pivot to a more slice-of-life approach, which, don't get me wrong, I love the world building in this series, so I think it can work, but from an action and adventure perspective, I think it's very hard for the reader to care, because William is effectively unbeatable, and so there is no risk, and so there are no stakes, so it's hard to grab the reader's attention. If it was me, I would not have made William even stronger, but let's see what the author does with this. And that's my only real criticism of the book, really. Besides that, I loved everything. I loved the epic fights, I loved the emotional moments, and I loved the unholy alliance between Gracefield and Stagnate, who apparently are sisters, in a plot point that seems shocking but is actually quite fitting if we really think about it. And speaking of shocking, Stagnate is not only a lady and Gracefield's sister, but she's also a horny freak. She wants William's kids, and that is a funny subversion of the usual harem that there's always in these isekai where the protagonist gets all the girls. Here William gets no girls, but he does have goddesses, which are completely crazy for him, perhaps not in a way that he would like, so that's a pretty funny plot point. So overall, I can't praise this book enough. To me, it's my favorite one in the Faraway Paladin series, and I'm very curious to see where the author goes from here. So I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did, and I'll see you on the next video. Ciao!